Jar Jar was never to see his homeland again. When he was finally allowed to return home, he died en route. The influence of the British was growing. The southern protectorates coalesced into political units. By the 1890s, they had rudimentary governments. They had customs departments, medical and postal services, and even a small army. And yet the most violent resistance in the south was still to come, from Oba of Anramwen of Benin. The British provoked him. He fought back. He was captured and exiled, his palace ransacked, his kingdom the last to fall to the British in southern Nigeria. Even chiefs who thought they could work with the British ended up opposing them.
Some accepted British to sign agreements with the British, perhaps because their enemies were opposing the British and so on. Even some of those, like the rulers of Ibadan, the Abuah, or the ruler of Oyo, who accepted a treaty, found that they had to face British military power later on. So you might as well, have resisted from the beginning.
In the early 1900s, the protectorates were reduced to two, to further streamline administration as the pace of colonial expansion quickened. It was Sir Frederick Lugard, employee of the Royal Niger Company, later High Commissioner, who seized control of northern Nigeria. He claimed local rulers had broken trading agreements. He deposed the emirs of Nupe and Yola and replaced them with friendly rulers. With his expeditionary force, he took control of Kano, then Sokoto. The Sultan of Sokoto, Atahiru, escaped. He was pursued by the British 900 kilometers to Burmi. There, Atahiru was defeated and killed. The huge Sokoto Caliphate in the north was now under British control. Colonization of Nigeria was now complete. Lugard and other British officials were now ruling through traditional authorities. They simply didn't have enough staff nor money to rule directly. This system of indirect rule worked best in the north, where the High Commissioner actually appointed emirs. The British cloaked its economic expediency with moral justifications.
I think it's true to say there is a moral element in this, a sincere belief that it is better to allow Nigerians to continue to live under the way in which they have been used, the kind of rulers that they have been used to having.
In 1914, Lugard was also behind the amalgamation of the northern and southern protectorates into a single entity, Nigeria. No Nigerians were consulted, and the British had no desire to unify them. They did want to simplify administration and allow the north to share in the trading wealth of the south. Unifying the railway system had been one important motive, and long a dream of Lugard's, to open up the north and increase trade by linking the two competing railway lines. One line was being extended to Kano and Baro on the Niger. It would eventually link with another from Port Harcourt. Amalgamation made commercial sense, but it did Nigerians no favors.
The basic thing was that its objectives were limited to British interests, namely to govern these people as quickly as possible.
Lugard developed an expedient but divisive form of colonial rule. Despite the amalgamation, he didn't set up a central administration. The north and south remained regionalized under separate lieutenant governors. Western influence was particularly divisive in education, spread through the south by mission schools. Their academic instruction took no account of African values. However, in the north, the traditional system of Quranic institutions continued as before. These differences in education further divided north from south.
The early missionaries were not allowed at all in the north to operate. So the Christian missions had no opportunity of operating in the north. they were allowed free access in the West. Therefore, it was easy for Quranic schools to start in the North. Quranic schools, which were schools along with their religion, it was easy. Something which they had been doing before and which at the material time became a system which had to be given force of law. Whereas in the South, the missionaries had already started evangelization. And along with evangelization, they started schools. Schools to train evangelists, ministers of religions, and clerks and things like that. So all the various missions, the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Methodists, and so on, they started their schools. So between us here and the North, there were two separate systems.
After the turn of the century, the various peoples of Nigeria mixed in the new towns that grew with trade and administration. But with the British had come bureaucracy and a need to identify people to meet official classifications. This labeling would underline divisions within Nigerian society. Diverse people were encouraged to think of themselves in terms of the main tribal groupings.
The colonial system itself certainly encouraged people to identify themselves as Yoruba. You have to fill forms and declare what your tribe was. And, you know, in those places, the ethnic identities, and there were usually new types of identities that were came with the necessities of the colonial period. Many of the urban areas were mixed, but people within those urban areas identify themselves at different levels. But when it came to a place like Lagos, when the Yoruba had to confront the Igbo in competition for jobs and so on, then you identify yourself as Yoruba and the Igbo as Igbo, and you know that those kinds of identities became much sharper, much more confrontational as the colonial period wore on.
After 1914, traditional society came to be transformed by Western influences. In the north, Lugard now introduced indirect rule on a large scale. There, the emirs remained responsible for tax collection and the courts in a traditional structured society. Elsewhere, the system worked for a time through paramount chiefs, but where there were no such rulers, the British simply created them. These warrant chiefs commanded little respect. Popular resentment grew while the British were now reaping the financial rewards of amalgamation.
Let me just stress the fact that, of course, it was a typical example of British colonial policy, which continued right until 1949 to the Colonial Development and Welfare Act, that every colony must pay for itself. Nobody's going to get an imperial grant in aid, which Northern Nigeria was getting. So if you put these two protectors together, you're going to save manpower, you're going to make it more economically viable. This would be one of the real rationalizations of it.
But the British administration paid no heed to the wishes of Nigerians.
There was no idea of consulting with Nigerians as Nigerians, or not even with southern Nigerians or northern Nigerians.
In 1914, the Ijemo massacre was to be a symptom of the deep resentments caused by the British. By treaty, the Abeokuta area in the west had remained a semi-independent state. Lugard wanted to change that. The death of a local dissident in prison gave him the opening he needed. After angry demonstrators took to the streets, troops were called out from Lagos. They opened fire, and many civilians were killed. Lugard now argued that a local government which had to depend on troops from Lagos to maintain order simply wasn't capable of self-rule. So he broke the treaty governing the status of Abeokuta and brought it into the protectorate system. The incident typified colonial cynicism. Any resistance was seen as a pretext for strengthening British control. The autonomy of the North grew, even while in the South indirect rule provoked resentment. By now, British officials were emphasizing the North-South differences. This attitude of divide and rule was to damage the future process of nation building. the consolidation of powers in the hands of an elite was to sow the seeds of future abuse. In the East, warrant chiefs were proving so unpopular that the British had to resort increasingly to direct rule. And yet, after the First World War, a national consciousness slowly began to emerge, a growing sense of national identity. Despite the divisions nurtured by the colonial power, the creation of a single Nigeria was giving birth to a nascent nationalism. The new nationalists were no longer thinking in tribal terms. They didn't yet seek independence for Nigeria, but they were demanding a say in running their own country. The first movements were Pan-African, grouping the separate nationalisms of different African colonies. Accra, Ghana, 1920, the site of the founding of the National Congress of British West Africa. It demanded that Africans should sit on legislative councils in each British West African territory, including Nigeria. Among those attending the founding conference was the Nigerian nationalist Herbert Macaulay. These early nationalists were roundly denounced. The Governor-General at the time, Sir Hugh Clifford, believed a centralized nation could never integrate Nigeria's diversity. In a speech, he attacked the idea of a unified Nigeria in terms that were a pretext for the continued policy of divide and rule. Assuming that the impossible were feasible, that this collection of self-contained and mutually independent native states separated from one another, as many of them are by great distances, by differences of history and traditions, and by ethnological, racial, tribal, political, social and religious barriers, were indeed capable of being welded into a single homogeneous nation, a deadly blow would thereby be struck at the very root of national self-government in Nigeria, which secures to each separate people the right to maintain its identity, its individuality, its own chosen form of government, and the peculiar political and social institutions which have been evolved for it by the wisdom and by the accumulated experience of generations of its forebears. Shortly after this speech in 1922, Clifford did introduce a new constitution. It entitled Africans to 3 seats on the 46-member Lagos Legislative Council. Some historians still claim that this represented a genuine change of heart by Clifford, a colonial change of attitude.
In which there is talk of the sacred trust of colonies. There is talk about the responsibility of colonial powers being to hold people's hands, and then the actual word, until they can stand on their own feet. Paternalistic, if you like, very, but nevertheless a move suggesting that after World War I, the whole questioning of what colonies is about is being looked at under, if you like, the remote but nevertheless real eye of the League of Nations.